Welcome to the Fit Rich Life podcast, a show where we talk about money, entrepreneurship, health and fitness, and building a life you absolutely love. Can you make $100,000 a year and become a millionaire by age 36 without a college degree? In today's special guest episode, I chat with John Henry from Millennial Wealth about how he achieved financial freedom using high-paying jobs that don't require a college degree. In this episode, here are some things you will learn about. 1. Jobs you can make $100,000 per year without a college degree. 2. John's journey with real estate. 3. 4 keys to building wealth. 4. Creating an online business, and a whole lot more. This is a great show for anyone interested in achieving financial independence without a college degree. The insight, strategies, and wisdom that John shares will empower you on your money journey. Please enjoy a wide-ranging conversation with John Henry from Millennial Wealth. John Henry, welcome to the show, brother. Good to have you here.
Justin, thanks for having me.
So, to kick things off, how the heck did you buy 4 properties while working in a mall selling cell phones?
Slowly but surely. Well, it started off with me buying some infomercial products online on a late night television show.
What kind of information products?
Carlton Sheets. It was a long time ago. I bought his no money down program. So that was kind of the start of me. My real estate adventure is late night television.
And what kind of money were you making, like selling cell phones? Because like when I think of people selling cell phones in the mall, I'm like, that cannot be very much money. What kind of money were you making when you're doing that job?
Back then there's people that were making really good money. It was the early 2000s. So if you were good, you could make like in the 90s to 100. So I was in the upper end at the time. So it definitely helped as far as qualifying to buy back then. I don't know that you can make that much now, but it paid well in the early 2000s before the iPhone.
That's pretty amazing. And what part of the world were you doing this in?
I lived in LA for 3 years, and then I lived in Seattle after that. So I was in Seattle when I bought my first place.
Okay. So let's rewind a little bit. I know you write an incredible newsletter called Millennial Wealth, and I've in preparation for this interview, I read through a bunch of them, and I'm curious. I want to share with the audience kind of like your money situation growing up. Like walk us through kind of like the beginning of your money journey, like back in childhood.
Well, I was raised by a single mom, my brother and I. So my dad actually passed away of cancer when I was 12, and my brother was 9. So my mom had to raise us on a modest income. So that was the first part of life where I became aware of what it's like to not have a lot of money. So it was really hard for my mom getting through those years and talking about money and there not being enough. And we weren't poor, but it was tough. So that was when I really started to think a lot about money and what it's like to not have a lot. So that's when I decided, hey, I'm going to figure this money thing out, because when I'm older, I don't want to feel I don't want it to be as though I have a lack, And when I looked around, a lot of my friends and other family members, money was a challenge for them too. So I kind of made a commitment to myself. It was something I wanted to figure out as a young adult.
Were there any specific like books or mentors that kind of like help, start to shape your financial path?
When I was 18, 19, I decided I was going to go to Barnes and Noble and read all the books in the personal finance section because I didn't have money to buy them. So I spent hours just reading books about personal finance. So I think in a way for me, it kind of became an obsession that I wanted to figure it out. Basically, what what are successful people doing that aren't living paycheck to paycheck, worried about, paying their bills each month. So I kind of viewed the authors of the books that I read as my mentors at the time, because I didn't have any family members or friends that were well off or own businesses or anything like that. So I just kind of engorged myself with reading the books and reading the stories of what other people had done. And I figured if I just copied what other people did that were successful, I'd be doing okay.
Were there any specific books that stand out in your memory as like being particularly impactful?
I'd say Think and Grow Rich was the first book I read, one of the first books, and The Millionaire Next Door. I think about that one a lot. So The Millionaire Next Door is a good one. I think it's good for myth busting, because everybody kind of has this idea of what it's like to be in a really good place financially, and reality is not exactly what we envision sometimes. So that was a great one, a peek behind the curtain type of thing when I read it.
Yeah. Yeah, that one's really powerful. I read that when I was pretty young too, because I think, especially in this day and age of social media, everyone thinks like millionaires are, driving the flashy cars and living in like super nice houses and, going on all these vacations. But like when it comes down to it, usually like millionaires, like most of them don't look super flashy. They're kind of like more of that like stealth wealth status, but they've achieved a certain level of financial independence that has really allowed them to live life on their own terms.
Yep, exactly. It's the billionaires that are doing that stuff, that other stuff.
Yeah. So I'm curious, did you go to college or did you go like straight into working at a mall selling cell phones?
I This is embarrassing to share, but I got like a $10,000 scholarship when I graduated high school, and I went to college like an hour and a half away from home for 2 months, and then I quit, and then I moved back home and sent the scholarship money back, which is embarrassing to share. My mom was really mad. Obviously, she thought that was a terrible idea, and I got a job selling phones in the mall. So, thinking back, that doesn't sound like a very wise thing to do, but life's funny the way it tends to work out in the end. So,
I actually have a similar story. So I dropped out of college. I stopped out of college
mhm.
with only 2 quarters to go, and it took me 8 years to come back and finally finish my degree. So
Mhm.
I feel you on kind of the late finish.
Yeah.
What was going through your head like when you like went to school for a few months? Why did you decide to drop out and move back home? What was going through your mind at that time?
At the time, it was the first time I lived by myself as an 18-year-old kid. So, I think ultimately I just wasn't ready to move away from home and live by myself, and that was kind of my reasoning for going back home at that time. So I didn't really have a good reason at the
Yeah.
time, but it seemed like one.
Okay. So you're selling cell phones at the mall. How long are
Mhm.
you doing that before you get your first property?
Gosh, I sold phones in the mall in my hometown. Then I moved to LA and did the same thing in LA for 3 years. Then I moved to Seattle, and that's where I bought my first property. So I think I was 23. Yeah, I was 23 when I bought my first property. It was no money down. It was a little condo. So I just had to come in with closing costs. It was a couple $1,000 for the closing cost. Then I closed on the property and had a friend move in because I didn't want to pay the whole mortgage myself. So I rented part of it to a friend. And that's kind of been my strategy along the way, is buy a property, move in, rent part to a friend. If you're single, it's a lot easier. If you're a couple, obviously you have a second income already. So that's how I purchased the first property.
So basically, you were you aware of the idea of like house hacking at the time, or did you just like randomly be like, "Ah, I'd love to get a roommate to help me pay this"?
It kind of just naturally developed. I didn't really know the term house hacking isn't really something that people know much of. It's kind of a strange term, but it really wasn't my plan. It just kind of developed that way. So that first property I bought, I lived there for 2 years, put 2,000 ish down. My friend moved in. I sold it 2 years later and made 100. And then I used that money as a down payment to buy a house. And then, of course, at the time I thought, wow, this is great. I didn't put hardly any money down. I made 100 grand. I didn't have to pay the whole mortgage because I shared it with my friend. And then my friend just moved into the house and we just continued forward with that same plan.
I
But I
love it.
think with real estate, that's the most powerful thing is that you can buy with a small amount down and you have control of this asset. I know not everybody is a fan of that strategy, but it's still an option these days, even though the rates are higher, to purchase with a low down payment.
Yeah. So tell me about the third, fourth, and fifth property.
So the third one, I actually had to put my own money down. So the first two, I didn't really have to come out of pocket much. And the third one, I think it was 10 or 15% down. It was a little condo in downtown Seattle. So the location was amazing. And I rented that out initially. So it was the first time I actually got a renter in the property. So the lady moved in. I eventually lived in that property a few years later, made it my primary residence, but it was just a rental starting off. A year after I bought that one, I bought another little condo downtown, and I actually moved into that one. So I moved out of my house, rented it out, and moved into that little condo and lived there for a year or two. But that was the one I had to come up with the most money, is that fourth property out of pocket.
Gotcha. So I know kind of it was not for another 4 years until you bought your fifth property. Why was there such a big gap in between the fourth and the fifth property?
Well, Justin, it's because I got fired and I couldn't get a loan.
Ah.
So it turns out I was good at selling phones, but I wasn't very good at being a manager. So I worked my way up and became a manager, and I managed a couple locations, and I wasn't very good at that. So that's when I transitioned into banking. Sometimes getting fired is a terrible thing, but later on, you're so glad it happened. So that's why I didn't buy for a few years, as I was transitioning away from selling phones in the mall and working in banking. So I got a job as a banker, and I did that for about 9 months, just a general banker. And then I ended up moving into doing mortgage loans for the bank, which I loved. It was like a great job for me since I love personal finance and real estate as well. So I bought 3 more properties. It was a lot easier to buy those knowing about loans and working for a bank. It definitely made things easier. So the property I'm in now, it was the fifth property I bought, and I bought this property with a low down payment like 10 years ago. And one thing I didn't mention is the first house I bought, it had a little area to rent out, like a separate area. And the house I'm in now, it also has like a separate area to rent out. So I think a good strategy for people to think about is when you buy, especially in a high rate environment now, in a high cost environment, it can be a good idea to find places where you can rent part of the property out. So the renter in this property, he has like his own separate entrance, and he never comes into the main part of the house. He's kind of has his own living room and separate area that he lives, and it covers like 30% of my rent, or 30% of my mortgage roughly.
That's pretty incredible.
So that can be a good strategy, is to, to kind of think about it in that way, where you're not necessarily paying the whole mortgage yourself, especially if you're a single person, finding a situation where you can
Yeah.
rent part of the property out.
So with rates being so high right now, like, do you think it's still possible for people to, kind of start the real estate journey?
I think it is. It just depends on your goals. And I was actually crunching numbers last night before we were doing this call and just looking to see what the average house price is, and if you put down a low down payment, if you were comfortable with that. The average first time buyer puts down around 8%. So a lot of people think when you buy, you have to come up with 20% down, but 80% of people get a mortgage roughly, and first time buyers usually put down 8%, 7% in that range, sometimes less, sometimes more. So if I was doing it over again, I was thinking about it this last night. I'd basically do the same thing I did before. I'd buy a property and then I'd have somebody rent part of it. Ideally, you can rent a room to somebody, but then you're sharing. So you have to be okay with that. Or find a property where there's like a separate living area so you don't have to share the common space with the other person. I think that's what most people prefer. So you just have to make sure you're looking for properties that have that type of characteristic.
I'm curious how you like thought about saving money during your time, both as, selling cell phones and as a banker. I know that a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
even when they make a good income of say, 90 to $100,000, they suffer from, what is called lifestyle inflation, where they just keep spending more as they earn more. So what were some of the things that empowered you to like
Mm-hmm.
actually decide that you're going to save a portion of your earning?
Well, when I spent all that time reading books at Barnes and Noble, the four takeaways I had really from all that was number one, make a high income. And I know that sounds really obvious, but the other three things are really hard to do if you don't make a high income. So you have to find a job where you're going to get paid really well. If you make a low wage, it's really hard to save and invest. So basically think through what type of work you can get into where you can make a high income. And that's why I sold phones in the mall as long as I did. I would have friends go to school, get their degree, come out of school, start working, and I was making double what most of them were making still without a degree. So for me, it's not fancy to say I sold phones in the mall, but I was able to buy property because of it, because it paid really well. So of the four things I learned though, number one, make a high income. You can always do that in sales. You can be an introvert and be good at sales. It's just a skill you have to learn, really. So, number two, save 15% of what you make. So, that was like my second takeaway, reading all those books. Number three, invest in stocks. And number four, invest in real estate. So, it was kind of like this 4-step plan. Figure out a line of work where you can make a lot. And if you can't make a lot right away getting into it, make sure you can work into other positions that pay really well, like banking. If you're a banker, it doesn't pay tremendously well like an entry level banker, but you can move into other roles pretty fast and get paid really well. So to kind of think about that first, I think for most people is think about what you can do that would pay really well, or you could at least get to a point within a few years where you're getting paid really well. And it makes those other three things on the list much easier to
Yeah, and
do.
I want to clarify for the audience. Um, Oftentimes, people when they hear banker, they might think either like working at an investment bank, like Morgan Stanley or something like that. But the type of banking you're talking about is literally like a bank like Wells Fargo or Bank of America, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I was not a fancy banker in New York City, not at all. Just a local bank where you walk in there and you say, "Hey, you hiring? Here's my resume." It's basically a sales job if you work at a bank. So it was my favorite job I ever had. I mean, you have the best hours. It's a professional environment. You get paid really well. Not starting off, but most people will start as a banker and they don't make all that much. But then you could be a business banker, a loan officer, a financial advisor within a year or two. And those jobs all pay 6 figures, and you don't need a degree for any of those jobs. one thing I think people don't realize is you can literally be a financial advisor and you don't need a degree to be a financial advisor. There's just, you have to think about jobs that you can do where you don't need to have a high level of education. And it's usually sales based jobs. And I know people say, oh, I'm not a salesperson. You don't have to be. The best salespeople I've ever met are introverts, people that aren't extroverted people, because the people that listen usually sell the best. If you listen more than you talk, it's just a learned skill type of thing. But if you don't like sales, there's other things you could do, like tech. I have a friend that works in tech that's done really well, and he doesn't have any degrees either. So there's other
Yeah,
options
I
as
also think
well.
it's, one of the, myths is like you have to go to a college to get a high paying job. And, it's unfortunate because then a lot of
Yeah.
people who maybe college isn't the right move for them end up going to college, racking up a ton of school debt,
Mhm.
potentially getting a degree in, something
Yeah.
they're not even interested in, but it was just like the easiest thing for them to do. And then they have to spend years kind of like, paying
Mhm.
off that debt. Whereas like if you took an approach more similar to yours, where
Mhm.
you're like, what is the highest income I can make without a degree, and like go and find those jobs. And like you mentioned, being like a banker at a Wells Fargo or a Bank of America, or Chase, like all of those, you
Mhm.
may not make six figures in your first year, but like within a year or so you're making six figures. And as you mentioned in some of your articles, like it's great hours, like you have every like holiday off, and you're able to kind of get a
Mhm.
insight into some of the inner workings of finance. I can imagine that kind of working as a doing mortgage loans kind of gave you even more confidence to build your real estate portfolio. Would that be correct?
It definitely made things easier because when you go to school, you don't learn about credit. You don't learn about buying a home. There's so many things you don't learn about. When you go to school, you learn the basics and they kind of steer you in this direction of get a job and get a student loan and work 40 years and everything will be fine. But there's a lot of stuff you have to kind of learn on your own if you want to figure out the money aspect of things. If you don't have a mentor, like a family member that can kind of guide you, that's done really well financially, it's you just have to take time and figure that stuff out yourself, unless you're okay with the traditional route of working 40 years and retiring in your 60s and doing that sort of thing. But banking made it a lot easier to learn that stuff.
So circling back on the real estate a little bit, I know the fifth house that you bought. Um, you mentioned in one of your articles that the inside looked like a 1970 house and it needed a lot of work. I'm curious, did you renovate it yourself? Did you pay other people to do it? Were you trying to flip the property? Kind of like walk us through that scenario.
That's the place I'm in now. So yeah, this looked like the Brady Bunch house when I moved in. Every room was just wallpaper. There was like 5 chandeliers in the house. It was straight out of the 70s for sure. Um, with working in real estate, I knew an agent that also owned like a contracting business. So when I bought this house, I used him as my agent, even though I really just needed his license because I understood like the process of buying. I just needed him to let me in and write the offer. So he basically comped like 60% of his commission to do updates in the house. So he sent his guys over and it was a good deal. But with real estate, there's lots of stuff you can negotiate. So that was something that kind of worked out to my advantage. So I've still paid out of pocket to do a lot of stuff to this house, but he helped me kind of get going in the beginning, get rid of the wallpaper, get rid of the popcorn ceilings and
Gotcha.
that sort of stuff.
Um, so I know your sixth property was a 3 bedroom, and you actually got it from a family member. So walk us through kind of how that works, because I think there's some
Mhm.
cool insight that a lot of people are unaware of.
Yeah, this is something I've talked about online too. When you buy from family, if it's a family member selling directly to another family member, most of the time you don't need a down payment, because when family sells to family, it's usually a good deal. Usually you're not paying full price. So whatever deal they're giving you is considered the down payment in the mortgage world. So if a house is worth 400 and you're buying it for 350 or 380 or 390, it's considered gift equity. So that's your down payment, basically, the equity in the property. So I bought that property after a family member passed away instead of it being sold. And there was some gift equity in that sense. So I didn't have to come up with the down payment, which was nice at the time, even though it was kind of a unfortunate situation. But that's something worth, when family sells to family,
So
that's
help me
kind of a perk,
understand, did you just take over the
is the gift
mortgage
equity.
payment, or like how did the like did you put up $350,000? Like how did this work?
I had to get, that's a good question. I had to get my own mortgage. So it's like a normal sale when you go buy a house, except usually you don't have to come up with a down payment because you're getting it for a better price than the normal market price. So I applied for a mortgage just like you normally would, and had a purchase agreement to buy the property just like you normally would, but instead of coming up with the down payment, there was gift equity, which is the discount that I got on the property, the smaller
That's great.
discount. So it's like a regular sale.
So essentially you just took out a mortgage with no down payment and then just started paying that monthly mortgage without having to come out of like pocket for any sort of down payment. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, it's like the first condo I bought. It was a zero down loan, and I just had to come up with the closing cost. So buying from family, it's usually the same situation. And working for the bank, I would do these loans all the time. Mom selling to the daughter, grandpa selling to the grandson. This people do this all the time. It's just you don't hear much about it. It's not talked about very often. I think just because of the dynamic, really, when you're getting a house at a discount because it was a family member's house, you don't usually talk to your friends about
I'm
that
glad we
stuff.
have you here to talk about it because everyone, not everyone, but I'm sure a large majority of people at some point in their life, they're going to have a family member who has a home and they pass away and, or they want to downsize, right? And if you can take that larger house over for them and they can help you out in on your financial journey, I think that's a really powerful strategy that like people could utilize.
Yeah, it's a good option sometimes for family members that usually people will say when I talk about this, well, it's best just to wait until the family member passes away and then transfer the property. And it is usually tax wise, but sometimes a family member needs the money right away and they can't wait. So they'll sell it to another family member while they're usually in retirement age or approaching retirement age. So it's a strategy a lot of
That's
people
great.
use.
So let's talk about the seventh property. It was a 3-bedroom house. I think you had a challenge getting a loan, and I think this was the one where you potentially tried to flip it.
Yeah, this one was my one attempt at trying to flip something. And for me, one time was plenty. Not doing that again. Not for me. But it was an interesting situation. And the house, it was close to the last house I bought. It was only like a block or two away. And it was behind in the property taxes, like 5 years. And it was empty. So the county, if you don't pay your property taxes for 3 years or 5 years, usually the government will take the house. So it was kind of in that process of being taken. And the inside of the house, it was just, it could have been on that TV show Hoarders. It was really bad, the inside. So there was just no way to get a mortgage on it, because when you get a mortgage, the bank will do an appraisal and look at the house and make sure that they want to do a loan on it. And this was just a situation where no bank would want to do a normal loan on the house. So I caught up the property taxes. I talked to the owner of the house, and they were just going to let it go and let the government take it. So this was like the one creative financing thing I did. So I got the taxes caught up, and I agreed to pay her a certain amount. So it was a really good deal overall to buy the house, and it was a good deal for her too. It was a family member passed away, and the house would have to go to probate for her to be able to get the house. So it's a long story, but it worked out well in the end. My cousin actually bought the house from me after that. So I didn't end up keeping the house. He bought it from me, so I made a little money off of selling it to him, and he has since fixed it up, and it's worth a lot more than it was before. So it turned out well for him, and it was a good learning
Now,
experience for me.
why didn't you like the process of flipping?
Well, it was 600 miles away from where I live. It wasn't, I'm in Southern California. This was in Northern California, way up at the top of Northern California in a small community. So there's just a lot to it. On TV, you watch those shows and, it seems I could do that. That doesn't seem too hard. But in reality, it's a different story.
So if someone did want to flip a house, like how would you recommend
But
they do it? Would they purchase something that's like within driving distance of themselves? Like what are some of the hard learnings?
that would make it a lot easier. So basically having a plan in place before you buy the house. The challenge too is a lot of times when I worked at the bank, people would say, "Oh, I want to buy a fixer." But the challenge is a lot of times you can't get a loan on a fixer. You can't get a normal loan on a fixer a lot of the time because a bank or a credit union, they don't usually want to make loans on stuff that isn't immediately habitable where someone can live there and there's no issues. So you usually have to get special loans for those types of properties. So if you're just the average person trying to do a flip, it can be hard unless you have access to a lot of money to be able to buy. When I worked in banking, a lot of people that would do flips, they would buy cash a lot of times and then fix the house up and get a loan on it later. So that's kind of a normal way people would do that sort of thing. But if you want a fixer, a good thing to do is just find an outdated house. So one that you can live in that's in good shape, but it's just outdated and not so pretty to look at. So those can be good fixers where you can still get a regular loan on it.
So I know eventually you sold off 4 of the 7 properties. Walk us through kind of the timeline and the reasoning behind that.
So I sold that one that I attempted to do the flip on, and then I think I had that one for like a year and a half before I sold it, or 2 years. And then I had my first condo that I sold to buy the house, to buy my first house. And then I eventually sold that house too. So those are the 3 I've sold. Yeah. Looking back, when you sell a house, you're so excited to get the money. But one thing is you'll look back 4 years later and you'll think, oh my God, why didn't I keep that? But getting the money's great, but later on you kind of have these regrets of, oh, why did I sell that? If I just kept it, look what it would be worth now. So my MO when I started buying properties was I'm going to keep all this stuff long term. I never really wanted to flip except for that one time. My goal always was, let me just keep it for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, because when I did all my research, that's most people that are doing well financially own property and they've had their properties for decades. So real estate on average since the 90s has doubled in price every 14 years. So if you just buy something, even if you don't put a huge down payment and you just hang on, of course, nothing in life's guaranteed, but it's been a good bet since the 90s, real estate.
So
that was kind of my idea to get started.
And why did you decide to sell those 3 properties?
Well, the first one was to buy the house. So I couldn't really get what I wanted if I didn't sell the first one. And the value went up so fast on that first one. I thought, well, let me take this 100 out of this and just move it over here because it had only been 2 years. So I probably wouldn't have bought the house otherwise without that down payment. And then I sold the house probably like 12 years later. That's probably my biggest regret, is selling that house in Seattle. So it was just I live in Southern California now, and I sold that house and it was in Seattle. So it was a challenge. If you have rentals out of the area that you live, condos are really easy, but houses are a little more of a challenge. When things go wrong, you need to have somebody you can always call to run over there. So I'd say I sold that one mostly just out of haste. It was vacant for like a month or two, and it was it was a challenge dealing with it living out of town, and I was really busy at work, and it was I did it basically just to kind of try to lighten the load.
Gotcha. So, what did you do like with the other than, taking money from that first condo and putting it into the house? Like, what about the other two properties that you sold? Did you take that money and like use it to pay down some of your current properties? Did you put it in the stock market? Did you just keep it in cash? Like, what did you actually do with the money?
I just invested it in the stock market from that after selling that house, so I held on to it, and I debated for years if I should pay down mortgage debt, but when the rates were so low, it was just hard to justify taking a chunk of money and then paying down a low mortgage rate when you could take that money and put it somewhere else and make more than the
Yeah.
rate you were paying on the mortgage. At least that was my logic at
I
the
think that
time.
logic paid out really well because I'm sure some of those loans are at the 2 or 3% or 4%, and now they're up around 7 or 8%. So I'm sure that actually played out pretty well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if yeah, it'll be interesting to see if the rates come back down. I think they will, but in the mortgage business, I'd say half of my friends have left because the rates have been so high the last few years. It'll be interesting when the rates come down, and I hope they do, so more people can purchase and it'll be easier. It might be a good opportunity for someone to come into the mortgage business that's contemplating it when the rates come down, because there won't be enough people to
Yeah.
help everyone.
So I know you left work about 4.5 years ago. What have you been doing over the last 4 years?
Well, I did loans at the bank for like 9 years, and in my 30s, I got to a point where I realized I just don't want to sit in a cubicle for 40 years. Sitting at the bank, I looked around and I saw these people that have been sitting in a cubicle for 30 years at the bank. By the way, I saw like 4 people get laid off in their 50s that had been there 30 years. So job security is not what it used to be. But for me, I decided it was time to move on and do something different. And I thought, well, I've done over 500 loans for people, so let me just leave full-time work, and I could just keep doing loans on a part-time basis and have more control of my time. So that was kind of my plan. And at the same time, I wanted to start an online business. In 2017, I started watching all these people and their online businesses, and everybody that stuck with it did really well. So that was my goal too, is let me start my own business online, and then I'll just keep doing loans part-time. That was my motivation when I left, and it was in the beginning of 2020, before everybody got stuck at home, is when I left. So I did mortgage loans part-time for like 2 years when everybody was stuck at home, and I did a lot more than I thought I would do when I left, just because the rates were so low. Everybody wanted a mortgage at that time. And then in 2023, I started working on my online business, and the mortgage business now is pretty much dead. Nobody really needs loans now or wants loans because the rates are so high, and everybody's kind of been sitting on the sidelines just in wait and see mode. So I think it'll get busy again, but
Yeah.
time will
So
tell.
now, are you living off your rental income? Are you living off your stock investments? Are you living off cash that you've saved up over the years? Like, how are you kind of footing the bill of life right now?
Well, 2000 or 2020, 2021, 2022, and the mortgage business was really good. So I've mostly just been living off investments. And then before I quit the bank, I'd also saved up a lot of money, and I had my property rental income. So it's it's something I'd planned on for a long time in my 30s. So I decided probably around my mid 30s I wanted to quit, and I didn't want to do the corporate thing anymore. So it took me a few years to kind of plan my finances out and get my expenses as low as I could get them and save up a lot of money and make the plunge and just start working part-time. That
And
was
what
my
age were
grand
you
plan.
when you started working part time?
38, 39.
Okay,
Yeah, 39
so you're around 41,
is when I
42
left
right
the
now.
bank.
Okay, same age as me then.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. So let's transition a little bit. Let's talk about the online business that you've been building. So I mentioned that I discovered you and your content through Threads because you just have really awesome content around money and business and mindset, and you write a really great newsletter, Millennial Wealth. So walk me through kind of your online journey. Like I know you're kind of in the build mode, but like what have you been doing for the last
Mhm.
several months, and where are you trying to go?
Well, after working in banking for so long, I thought, what could I do online? Because the interesting thing is, I could work at a bank and help a certain amount of people with loans, but there's just a limit on how much you can do in person, helping people one on one. So I thought, well, I want to start an online business because I can engage with thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, and just the upside is so much higher with an online business because you just have access to so many more people. So I thought, well, I bought a few courses and started reading more about online businesses. And over the years, I watched so many people in the personal finance space start an online business and just talk about finance every day. And most of them that stuck with it were just doing really well. So that was my motivation. I thought, let me just talk about personal finance every day. So I started an Instagram and a Threads and an X account, and I just started posting twice a day. And I think this was October of last year. So it's been like 8 months, 9 months. So I've been focused on it pretty much full time for the last 8, 9 months. I know a lot of people start this sort of thing part time while they're working full time. And with the high interest rates, I've kind of had the opportunity to just focus on it full time now. And I haven't really done much with loans for a few years now. And that's been my big focus, really. So I've spent a lot of time paying attention to big creators that have done really well. And I'm a big believer and fan of just find people that are where you want to be in life and just copy them. Do what they've done that's working well for them. So I've spent a lot of time just paying attention and taking courses and reading about what works and what doesn't work, and a lot of stuff with an online business and building it is
Are
just
there
trial
any
and error.
particular courses that you would recommend to someone else who's interested in this journey of online business building?
Yeah, the first two courses I did was Justin Welsh's courses, and he has two lower end courses you can buy that aren't very expensive at all, but they're amazing courses if you're a new person trying to figure out what you would want to talk about online and how you would go about it. So I think his course is $100 and it's a couple hours long. Content OS, I think that's what it's called. But he has two different ones, and those were the first two courses I did. Justin's courses. He used to work in the corporate world, and he left about the same time I did. I think a year before I did, and he started an online business, and he's done amazing. So there's a lot of people that have done great that are really good folks to kind of model and study and follow and
Yeah,
learn
I'm
what
a
works
huge
from.
fan of Justin Welsh. It's like he's really, mastered the whole like one man solopreneur business, creating
Hmm.
really a huge following. It's crazy how much he's grown, as well as how much revenue he's doing per year,
Hmm.
with incredibly high margins.
Yep. Yep. I'm also a fan of Dan Coe. So there's three guys I follow: Justin, Dan Coe, and Matt Gray. I'm part of Matt Gray's mentorship group, Founder OS. And those three guys are great to watch. Dan's in his 20s and he's doing really well. Justin is in his 40s. Matt's in his 30s. So they all kind of have their own take on how they go about what they're doing. And then they're all three successful at it. So it's kind of like take your pick. Do you want someone in their 20s to learn from, 30s or 40s, or all of them? So those are the three guys I've really paid the most attention to the last 8 months to kind of figure
Yeah,
out my own
I've
thing.
invested in one of Justin Welsh's course, which is awesome. I think it was called LinkedIn Operating System
Yeah.
or something. Um, and then also Dan
Yeah.
Coe's digital economics, as well as like he had a a group that has since evolved into something else, but it used to be called Modern Mastery. And I think it's evolved into like Cortex
Yeah.
something or other, but they've definitely figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I love, I'm most familiar with Dan Coe's work because I did like a deep dive on like him, is like he literally like failed so many times, like trying like all different things, like tried to have a fitness YouTube. He tried to have like a digital art Instagram, and he just like failed again and again, until he finally kind of like figured it out. And I think that is one of the most common traits of
Mm-hmm.
successful entrepreneurs is they've just failed more than everyone else.
Yeah. I think that's what's tough too with the online business space is there's kind of this picture painted that, oh, it's pretty easy and you just have to work a couple hours a day. But there's a lot to figure out. In the first year, I'm like 8 or 9 months in, and I've been doing it full time for 8 or 9 months, and there is so much to figure out. But if you're willing to figure it out and stick with it, most people do really well. You just have to be willing to. It's like getting a new job. That's what it's felt like for me. You're getting a new job and there's no training program and there's no one to ask any questions unless you buy courses online about it, and you're just kind of figuring it out slowly but surely. But if you stick with it, at least that's my theory so far.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what is kind of like your, if you're open to talking about it, you don't have to talk about it. We can talk about it offline if you don't want to talk about it online right now. But I'm curious, like, what is your monetization like path forward? Are you trying to build up the newsletter where you can get a newsletter sponsor? Are you trying to launch a course, a digital product of some sort? Like, what's kind of the path that you're tracking on?
The way I kind of see it is I look to see, well, what have these other people done that have been successful? And I'm just going to do what works. I think a lot of time in business, people try to reinvent the wheel. So I'm just ruthlessly copying what's worked for other people. And then when it's working for me, then I'll try some other stuff maybe on my own. So the three people I look to as mentors, they all write a weekly newsletter. So I started a weekly newsletter. Um, they engage online every day. So I do that too. Um, they all have courses. I've been working on my first course. It's been 2 or 3 months. And I got to say, that's been the most difficult thing is just figuring out how to do all of that stuff, the camera, the recording, the Google Slides. So it's exciting though, as you're going through and learning all this new stuff. And you just, for me at least, I'm just keeping my eye on where is it going to be in a year or 2 years or 3 years. That's what keeps me going, is just looking forward to all that. So for me, it's course. I've been working on a course about buying your first home. So that was the first course I wanted to release, since that's something I know a lot about. And it makes me sad that there's so many people out there that, especially Gen Z, where they seem like they've just given up on buying a home and just don't think they ever will because of the rates and the prices. So I'm hopeful that the stuff I've learned and also doing loans at a bank will be helpful for other people too, with a cheap intro
Yeah,
course to buying your first
I love
home.
it. Cool. Well, I'm excited for your first course to come out as we start to kind of wrap this show down and land the plane. I like to ask every guest to share a tip, tool, or
Mm-hmm.
strategy for health or fitness, one for money or wealth, and one for life. So, what do you got for us?
A money tip. Trying to get to my notes here. I'd say a money tip. One picture I try to paint for people when it comes to money that I've thought a lot about. You don't really learn about budgeting or money in school at all, right? So I like to view money as though your employer views money. If you worked at Apple, right? If you're a salesperson at Apple, every quarter they track their sales and they track their expenses and they say how much money they've made. Like they tell the world every 3 months, those three things: what they made, what they spent, and what's left over. So when it comes to money, I always try to explain to people that ask me what they should do is just to kind of look at your personal life in the same way, your personal finances. How much are you making? How much are you spending? How much are you keeping? And if you don't keep track of those three things, you just wing it, it's just hard to ever get ahead. It's just nearly impossible to ever get ahead if you're just winging it. You have to track those three things, just like your employer does. So if Apple stopped tracking their sales and their expenses, things would just go crazy. The numbers wouldn't look as great as they do. It's because they focus on it and they keep track. So when it comes to your personal money, I've found that that's just a good way to think about it, is to think about your personal finances just like your employer thinks about their personal finances. And I know it's not sexy to track your money. It's not a fun thing to do, but if you do, you can quit work in your 30s or your 40s or your 50s. If you do and you're willing to spend the time doing that stuff, you have a lot more options instead of working for
Yeah,
40 years.
absolutely.
But that's my money tip that I found is helpful, to try to envision it in
Yeah,
that
that's,
way.
a huge part of my kind of financial turnaround. Like I was one of those people who was winging it, just kind of uh, you know, thinking I was earning enough money and not spending too much, only to realize over the years I just accumulated more and more debt. And then kind of when I had like my financial awakening in my mid
Mm-hmm.
30s, like the number one thing that helped me kind of get things turned around was actually tracking my income, tracking my expenses, and tracking my savings rate. So, what percentage of my income was I actually keeping each month? And so, I think that is a super
Mm-hmm.
powerful tool that if you're not tracking those things, like, and your money situation isn't where you want it to be, like step number one is just start tracking those key areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely didn't have it all figured out either. It was trial and error for me mostly too. So it's interesting how you can read in books about all the things you should do, but a lot of times with the money, messing up is how you learn. So I've definitely messed up and made huge mistakes myself too. And those are the mistakes you learn. You remember the
Yeah.
most is the big money blunders.
So, how about
Mm-hmm.
fitness or health? What's a tip, tool, or strategy for that?
Let me see here. So for fitness, one thing I found with fitness and health is one thing I've learned myself is just to be really aware of what you're putting in your body and how it makes you feel when it comes to food and drink. And maybe this seems too obvious, but I've just learned over the years to pay really close attention to what you eat and drink and how it makes you feel. Because there's certain things that get you in the zone. Like for me, it's my coffee and my Starbucks burrito in the morning. And I'm in the zone for like 5 hours, super focused and writing and doing my thing. So I've just learned to, when it comes to what you put in your body, try to pay close attention to what makes you feel really good and gets you in the zone, and do more of that, and stay away from the stuff that doesn't get you in the zone. Or at least just be aware of what, makes you feel great and what doesn't make you feel great. And it helps with motivation a lot of times. If you're not feeling motivated, I found that a lot of times it can have to do with your diet.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful. I think a lot of people, they kind of just like eat based on like taste, but you're saying like eat based on like how it makes you
Mm-hmm.
feel, because ultimately how you feel each day is like the quality of your life. And I think especially if you're trying to, level up in life, like you got to feel your body in a way that empowers you to have that energy and that drive to get to the next level.
Yeah, exactly. It's been helpful for me, so hopefully it's helpful for others.
Awesome. So how about what's the life tip, tool, or strategy?
So here's a nerdy thing I've done for a long time. I'm sure I read it in a book somewhere, but I'm not remembering where. You know how in January every year people have their goals they set for the new year? So for me, life goals, I've always been in the habit of writing them down. Every January, write down like your 5 goals or your 6 goals and tape it on your mirror in the bathroom or put it on the refrigerator. And I know that sounds so cliche, but I've been doing it for like 15 years and it works. So if you write down your goals and you put them somewhere where you're going to see them every day, at the end of the year, you would have done like 90% of them. I think it's just a subconscious thing that I've never done it and got to the end of the year and I only accomplished 1 or 2. You'll literally do them, most of them, just because of that. So that's been a helpful tip for me, is just setting your yearly goals and make sure you see it every day.
I think that's so powerful. It's such a simple thing to do. But I think people underestimate like that your mind is like a goal seeking machine, but because we live in this world of like infinite distraction, social media, television, etc., that your mind's always kind of being reprogrammed to work on other potential goals. But if you have, a piece of paper or, on your bathroom mirror, like somewhere where you're like every day you're reprogramming your mind to go after your self-selected goals, like it's such a powerful thing to do. So I think that's a really powerful takeaway to leave the audience with.
And your friends will make fun of you, but that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
My friends
Oh,
always
I've
tease
actually
me for
done the
doing
same
that.
thing. I have like so I like to have like a Sharpie, or excuse me, a dry erase marker, and I have, in the past I've had like a
Mm-hmm.
mirror on the back door of my office, and so every time I walked out of my office I would
Mm-hmm.
see the goals. And right now I just like I have a whiteboard and a mirror, and I just like write my goals out on there. So, and I'm in my office like for hours,
Mm-hmm.
almost every day. And I just like constantly see my goals. And I'm like, am I working on these right
Mm-hmm.
now? Is there anything I can do to move them forward? So, yeah.
It's
100%.
for the
Well,
subconscious.
John,
Yep.
if people want to learn more about you and your work, and check you out, where's the best place for them to connect with you online?
I'm on Instagram, Millennial Wealth on Instagram, or Threads, Millennial Wealth on Threads. Or my website is the johnhenry.me.
Awesome. And we'll put links to all that in the show notes, so it'll be easy for listeners to find it out. John, thank you so much for coming on the show, brother. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Justin, for having me.